Hello and welcome back to Dollars and Dragons. And with me today we have Stefan Huddleston. If you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I am a longtime tabletop role-playing game fan and enthusiast. I started in 1977 with D&D, as so many people do start with D&D. As a young kid, I was 7 years old at the time. I walked into a bookstore and saw this box on the shelf, and I was like, "What is this?" And I picked up a copy, ran home, and I grabbed one friend from the neighborhood. And I was seven, and I read through this book and really didn't fully understand it at the time, but I got the enough of a gist, and we both made characters and started playing. I acted as kind of the GM and kind of had my character as like a GM PC. My buddy had a character, and we just started playing, and that's when I discovered tabletop role-playing games. And of course, that was 1977. Shortly thereafter, this little movie called Star Wars came out. And so, being 7 years old, lightsabers and all sorts of other things ended up in my D&D game, and it was just absurd and silly. And from there, I discovered eventually other players and other role playing games, and I played scores and scores of role playing games throughout the 80s. Of course, back then, my friend that I had grabbed and just kind of pulled into it, and I only played with him very briefly, like that year. I played with him. He was, for a very long time, the only other gamer who looked like me that I saw. There weren't, where I played, a lot of gamers who were black, pretty much overwhelmingly white at first. But then I was fortunate enough to fall in with a group that was pretty diverse, surprisingly diverse, where I had some players who were a couple who were Filipino, and one who was Korean, and one who was Egyptian. And I was amazed and glad to have that experience. And so I continued to play for years. I met my spouse, who I've been with now for almost 30 years, through a LARPing club. So role playing games have always been a huge part of my life. And so in the 2000s, actually back in 2013, I was laid off from the job that I had worked for years. I ended up going back to school, ended up getting my degree in history, continued on into my graduate studies. And in my graduate studies, I worked on several different things. The master's program that I was in, rather than, as some master's programs will have you write one big thesis, our master's program was different, where they had us write three different, more like mini theses, because they wanted us to have kind of a broader base rather than focusing on one thing. And so, as part of that, for the third of three that I wrote, and they all in some way related to issues of marginalized populations, race and gender, and other things like that. But for the third one, I got the idea. I said, I've been playing role playing games all my life. They're a huge part of my life, and I've never examined them academically. And role playing games had only had, comparative to other subject areas, limited exploration in academia. It's only in the last, say, 10, 15 years that, with a few exceptions before that role playing games have really heavily been examined in the academic sphere. And so I'm like, I want to do that from a historical perspective. Most of the academic stuff that I could find at the time was coming from either sociologists, or it was coming from other fields, other disciplines, and not a lot from history. So I wanted to go back and examine that. So I decided that I was going to go back and say, I know what my experiences were as a young black child and a young teen and all of that stuff growing up playing these games, but I wanted to look at it academically and say, what kind of data can I find about what were the demographics of role-playing games? What were the experiences of those, who was playing these games? What were the experiences of people who looked like me? What were the experiences of women playing these games? And so that's what I set out to do. And I wrote my third thesis on race and gender in early tabletop role-playing games. So I looked at like the first 10 years roughly of role-playing games from when D&D appeared, roughly till about 1984, 1985. And in order to do that, I looked at I picked a handful of the popular games of the time: Dungeons and Dragons, Empire of the Petal Throne, M.A.R. Baker's Tekumel. I looked at Traveler and a few other games. And then I took the first like about 10 years of Dragon magazine. And I said, I want to go through every single issue. I want to go through all of these games and look at how do they handle race. And then the other thing that I looked at as a source was a book called Shared Fantasy, written by a sociologist called Gary Allen Fine. And it was, as far as I know, it was the first academic look at tabletop role-playing games. Right at the beginning, in the late 1970s, as a sociologist, he joined some tabletop role-playing clubs, and he started playing these games, and he did the first ever ethnography of tabletop role-playing and wrote a book called Shared Fantasy. And I used that as a source to kind of examine what was happening with race and gender in those early years, and how did it impact, and what did it look like in comparison to my experiences. So yeah, that was so that's kind of my tabletop journey. And now I do some sensitivity consulting, and reading, I do commentary on tabletop space, and I continue to examine it from kind of historical and in some ways a sociological perspective of like what tabletop role playing and how representation impacts, particularly with marginalized communities based on race, based on gender, based on the LGBT community, and so much more. So those are my focuses. So that's kind of where I am as in relation to role-playing games.
Got it. Yeah. And right now you're a university instructor?
Yes. Yeah. So I teach as an adjunct, I teach some classes at the University of Colorado Springs, and then also at Pikes Peak State College here in Colorado Springs. I teach a range of mostly history courses and humanities courses. I teach U.S. history, African American cinema history, some pop culture history, a range of other things. And then I'm hoping this summer to run my first section of a course on culture through tabletop role-playing games, where I want to examine the recent spate of role-playing games that have been coming out in the last few years, like Islands of Sina Una and Coyote and Crow, and so many others that are written by people from various diverse cultures, and things like Thirsty Sword Lesbians and stuff like that are written from people from marginalized communities about their cultures and about their communities, rather than what we've seen for a very long time. So many games that were written by people from outside of various cultures, kind of writing, things like Oriental Adventures or something like that were written by people who rooted in those cultures. So hopefully that'll kick off this summer, if not then this fall.
Yeah, I'm actually running this very soon for the first time, so I'm excited about Thirsty Sword Lesbians. Have you heard a book called Monsters in America, Our Historical Obsession with the Hideous and the Haunting by W. Scott Poole?
I have. I've heard of it. I have not read it, but I've heard of it. It's on my list of things.
Yeah, so it's done by this person who basically, so I think it's relevant to share that this person's white, a white man. But it was my first introduction into like this sort of topic academically, because I took a college course taught by a queer Hispanic instructor who was. The class was basically like the intersection of like queerness and race and disability and horror in film. And so we studied everything from Dracula to like Halloween to like, all these various films where a lot of the horror stories or the frightening part of them was something to do with a marginalized individual or trope, or like some sort of bigotry associated with a different group, some outside group, other than the cisnormative, white, whoever was in that society at the time. Because like I remember very specifically for like Dracula, and the way that we were looking at examining that was at the English perspective of a Jewish Eastern European coming to England at the time, and essentially invading and taking their women and taking advantage of them. And there was a lot about the queerness of Dracula and a non-traditional relationship, having multiple partners, and all of that sort of like hedonism sort of played into these fears that the
Hmm.
cisnormative person would have about an outsider to their society coming in and either taking over or like taking advantage of you or like
Yeah.
being the boogeyman essentially.
Oh yeah, Dracula is so much like a lot of other horror of that kind of the late 19th and early 20th century, whether you're talking Dracula, whether you're talking about H.P. Lovecraft, a lot of horror from that era is really, and particularly it's amplifying the fears of the writers of fear of the other,
Yeah.
in these tales. And absolutely, yeah, there's a, well, you mentioned that book, there's a great documentary, which I don't know if you've seen. It's horror noir that looks at the black experience in the horror genre, in film in particular, in the horror genre. And that's one of the great things I think right now, and conversations that are being had with things like that, and across academia, is that so much of our past, when we looked at things, be it history or be it when we're looking at cinema history or pop culture history and these stories and stuff like that, so much of it has for a very long time been examined through a cishet white male lens. And there's a lot, I think, to be gained and a lot to be understood to go back and examine these things through other lenses and through, particularly through marginalized lenses, and ask some questions and kind of probe them from different angles than has always been the standard. And I think it opens up a lot of new horizons in our study of the past and of the stories that we tell.
Have you seen Blackula?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I should have said before that when I went through my studies, I minored in film.
Uh-huh.
So
Okay.
when I examine things as a historian, I do a lot of it. I link a lot of it through film, things like that. As a matter of fact, this fall, one of the instructors, one of my colleagues, is going to be on sabbatical, and we've worked together a lot and tend to think alike. And she's amazing. And she said, "Hey, I'm going on sabbatical in the fall. Do you want to teach my Vietnam War through film course?" And I'm like, "Do I?" Like, yeah, like history and film. That's I love it. So yeah, absolutely. If you're talking old films and cinema, pretty good chance I've seen it.
I never, of course, before this course and when I was and I took this course right when I was coming out and like I was just newly like queer and stuff. So this was a wonderful course for me to take at that time. I watched a lot of stuff and I experienced a lot of media through a very different lens for myself and really explored my own gender through viewing things differently and like looking at things from a different
Yeah,
perspective. And everything was definitely very interesting to sort of like watch, examine, comment about, think about, and even the stuff like that I never would have watched because I wasn't necessarily into that kind of stuff. Well, it
hmm,
turns out that I just became like a big horror GM after that because I watched all these horror films and I like, why does this work? How does this work? And then now like it's a part of how I built like such a big like professional career is like horror GMing and stuff. The intersection of like horror and identity is very like intertwined, and I find it to be really fascinating. I
yeah,
am interested in sort of examining all those films, that going back and looking at all of those different things. But for the most part,
yeah,
I am mostly interested in like taking a look at people's perspective who are from those communities
yeah, yeah.
more than me like putting out a bunch of writing.
Well, and I think too, although, there's obviously forces in this world that want to try and deny it, it is not as if, queerness was absent from Hollywood during, the entirety of its existence, right? And so
Yeah.
I think if you go back and you re-examine a lot of things through a different lens, you discover some amazing things in traditional Hollywood cinema that people were trained and acculturated to kind of look at through kind of again that heteronormative lens, and that is not at all what you see when you look at them through other lenses. And there are a great many wonderful classic films that are filled with amazing and just wonderful, glorious levels of queerness. When you really go back and you put that lens on, you're like, oh, wait a minute. I see what's going on here. Hold on. This was not what they were going for. Like what we're told. Yeah, it's amazing when you really do it. And I was fortunate enough when I was going through my studies and particularly the film studies, to have some very wonderful professors who were pointing these things out and going, hey, if you look at it through this lens and you ask these questions, you don't make those kind of like assumptions that are kind of hammered into us by quote unquote mainstream society, because that stuff was people try and make this thing that like queerness didn't exist in the past. And we all know that's BS, but people try and make it out like that. And it's there in books and in movies and things like that. You just have to kind of set aside those notions that have been hammered into us by society.
I actually just had this realization. I was chatting with Super Dylan. I was asking about like Neverland, and I made like kind of a cheeky question about like, how did you know that you were not cisgender, and why was it after you wrote the Neverland setting for D&D 5e? And they gave me like this really beautiful answer about like how Peter Pan is actually a trans allegory. And I was just like weeping within 5 minutes of the podcast, and I was like, oh no.
Yeah, I love Neverland and Super Dylan. Great stuff.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that it's not so much about in most of us within the community, it's not about transforming something into having it be queer, but like that queerness has been here the whole time. And that's how I feel about a lot of these opportunities that we have for producing media now and lifting our voices and things like that. So
absolutely. I was just going to say, I think it's wonderful to me, I think, because I hear so many stories and I see so many things. And when I was doing my research, I came across so many things of people, particularly in the TTRPG community, using tabletop role-playing games as part of their exploration of their identities. And I love that stuff. I think that's just, it's wonderful. I don't know how else I could put it. I love it.
Yeah, I actually was using role-playing games in writing to explore my gender from a very young age. I think it was like I was like 11 or 12 or something like that, and I was not only writing to explore gender and like trying to write these feminine characters in order to explore that for myself, but also I was role-playing these characters online through like a text medium like MUDs, if you remember MUDs, multi-user dungeons.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Text role-playing games. And people would ask me, they'd either be confused about like my gender and be like, what gender are you? Kind of ambiguous. And I would, of course, like then people found out that I was actually when I became an adult, that I was actually very masculine. I was in the Marine Corps and like all this other stuff. And like, why do you play femmes? And I was just like, well, my excuse at the time, and it's funny like how deeply you can like conceal these things from yourself, and like normative society will like force you to repress a lot of stuff and like not confront stuff directly. I was role playing the entire time I was in the Marine Corps, and prior to that really as a way of being somewhere where I could be accepted or I could be treated and greeted and loved for being a feminine person, even in the context of like all of these very dangerous and problematic places like Dark Sun inspired locations, right?
Right.
Yeah. Even in the context of like not knowing any better about some issues, but I think people are naturally drawn to explore both themselves and what they are trying to feel, because we have so many societal pressures to act a certain way.
I think honestly, if people were to be more honest with themselves, I think that people, no matter where they end up on the spectrum, even if they come out and say, I'm cishet and straight or whatever the case may be, I think that a lot of people, more that people than we're willing to admit it, still use role-playing games to one degree or another to explore their orientation and their sexuality and things like that. Sometimes not in some healthy ways, unfortunately, which was one of the things I wrote about in my thesis, in some very awful ways, but sometimes in some really good ways. And maybe they come to the conclusion, in the end that, they say, I'm cishet and straight or whatever. I think they still make those explorations sometimes into other things through role playing games. And then, like the story that you just shared, I think when I was doing my research, I heard so many, and I came across so many stories like that where people were saying, yeah, like, I explored my queerness, or, I explored my trans identity through role playing games. And that was part of my process of kind of, learning more about myself. And I think that's, again, I just love it. Like, my spouse identifies as bi, my youngest identifies as trans non-binary, and they both, talk about role playing games, and was part of them going through those processes. So,
Yeah.
I think it's amazing stuff.
Yeah, then it's probably no surprise to you that over half of my tables are not only like filled with queer people, but
Yeah.
I had one straight table for a while, but they're not straight anymore. Oh, they have queer. They had someone that's queer join the table, but
Yeah.
yeah, I majority of my players are queer, and like even the straight people, I think a lot of them, because of how I both present and the sort of community that I have built, it is such a safe place for people to explore that
Yes.
I've had a lot of individuals come out at my table and like sort of like they change their pronouns, and like, they are, after playing this character for a short period of time, like they discover that about themselves, and like it is the community for them to do so.
Yeah, I think, for a long time, when I was growing up and playing these games in my younger years, it just was not at all safe for people to come out. And obviously, there's still concerns and things like that today. Definitely less so than it was, in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. Things were just vicious and ugly. I'm so thrilled to see. And I think if we're being, for me, if we're being honest, it's a spectrum, and everybody tries to make these hard lines of like you're one end or you're the other. And really there are all these degrees in between. And I think my thinking is, and maybe I'm wrong, but my thinking is that majority of people are less on those ends than they might think. And they're more somewhere towards the middle to one degree or another. Societal pressures kind of force them to declare one of those ends. I just believe really probably not the case with so many people.
Totally okay if you don't want to talk about this, but what do you think, and have you looked into or thought about in regards to like people who go to prison and then they have these bisexual or these gay experiences for the first time because they're put in that situation, and like that's their only outlet as far as like those types of
Yeah.
relationships?
I think obviously, again, I think there's a spectrum there. And I think particularly in prison, and then for people, in my wild and life, I'm one of those odd people that had so many careers in my lifetime, and various jobs that I've gone through. And so I spent before the job that I was laid off from back in 2013. I spent 13 years in the fire protection industry. So we did work on the fire protection systems, fire sprinkler systems, fire alarm systems, extinguishers, special hazard systems, and computer rooms and things like that. The company I worked for was at the time the largest fire protection company in the world, and we had accounts with countless businesses and government agencies. And so I contracted through that with multiple law enforcement agencies. I've been down working on the fire systems at Supermax and in multiple prisons and things like that. And so I spent a lot of time, oddly enough, in prison environments as a contractor working on these systems, and got to, as part of that, a lot of times they would kind of like assign you, you'd have a guard there with you kind of keeping an eye on things. But a lot of times we worked alongside prison trustees and stuff like that in some of these institutions and some of the like minimum and medium security installations. And so I spent a lot of time working alongside a lot of people in prisons. Again, I think there's a lot of people who are in these environments, in prison environments, who they come from on the, before they came into the prison, and when they come into the prison, they come into an environment where there are these preconceived notions about orientation and sexuality and these societal pressures. And so I think that there are some of them who have, who are on somewhere, like I said, closer to that middle on the spectrum,
Yeah.
who may be queer on one part of the spectrum or another, who haven't been able to openly admit it because of the where they grew up and who was around them and the pressures. And then prison, it kind of puts them in an environment that for some of them changes that. I think there are some people there who honestly were probably somewhere on the spectrum, but wouldn't or couldn't admit it to themselves before they got there. And I think that's true of society in general. I think people are just, again, even now, as things are getting better, but we all know they're nowhere near there yet, and there's so much more left to do. It's hard, man. It's really, really hard for some people. For some people, obviously everybody's story is different, but it's so hard to maybe you have fears of disappointing a family member, or you have whatever is going on in your life. Everybody's story is different, and it's so hard to come out. And there are just hangups that hold you back. And I think that's true, like I said, in those environments and outside of those environments, I think everywhere. Oddly enough, it's interesting too. In that time, I talked to some people, and for a lot of people in prison, it's really fascinating that Dungeons and Dragons, TTRPGs, Dungeons and Dragons in particular, has become huge in prisons.
Really?
Yeah. I'll have to find, there's a really great article. I'll see if I can find it and link it to you. It's become huge in prisons and prisoners they can't have dice because dice are contraband, because they can be used for like gambling and stuff like that. But they've come up with an amazing array of creative ways to randomize and things like that. And then, sometimes they have access to the books, or sometimes they just, because again, ultimately role-playing games are pure imagination. So a lot of times they're just kind of winging it without the actual materials, but somebody knows enough about the rules to kind of work everybody through it. And it's become pretty big in prisons because, here you are, you can't go anywhere. And how are you going to spend your time? Same thing, I think, in those environments through role-playing games, and explorations of identity are happening in those things. And I'm really hoping someone in the academic sphere will do a deeper dive into that. Like, there's been some journalistic explorations, but I would love someone to do a deeper academic dive into role-playing games in prison environments, in particular, because it's become hugely popular over the last several years because, like I said, it's just you and your imagination, and it's like kind of a perfect environment for it, unfortunately for the people that are stuck there.
Two things. One, there's a lot of queerness in the military, and then two, there's a lot of role playing in the military. So in me, just like rear view mirror, of course, the joke had always been, even like when I was considered to be straight, and when I was in that environment, the Marine Corps is both the most homophobic and the gayest place that you'll ever be. So it's like a very self-loathing, like very masculine yet very queer environment, and people just don't understand that because they'll, call someone the F word at the same time that they go and be queer with all of their buddies in their squad, and you're sharing like these fighting holes together, and you're sharing these experiences, and in some cases, like, they'll jokingly like share a sleeping bag or something, or like cuddle. And like, honestly, there's so many queer times that I have personally had, and like other very masculine, Marines have had, like in the field and like away from society and away from the societal norms when you're out in the middle of nowhere. And really, it's just you and like your best friend, and it's so gay.
So my dad is a Vietnam era Marine, and I wouldn't tell him this because he'd probably have a heart attack. But he's that old school era, very old school Marine, the stereotypical jarhead. My dad. The fact is, if I think about it off the top of my head, as you mentioned it, I probably easily know. And here, in Colorado Springs, where I'm at, we've got 5 military bases. We've got Fort Carson Army Base, we've got NORAD, Peterson Air Force Base, the Air Force Academy, and Schriever Air Force Base, or now Space Force Base, I should say. But NORAD gets all the branches of service up there. And then, of course, through growing up, with my dad, I think I can honestly say that when you mentioned that, and then when I think about it off the top of my head, I said, yeah, you know what? I probably know more former Marines who came out as queer than any other service, any other branch of service. So that makes a lot of sense. It's like, yeah. When I
Yeah.
think about it, that's the
Uh,
case. Yeah.
a lot of it is, in my opinion, and this is just my personal like experience. A lot of it was for me that I was trying so hard to fit within the hyper masculine role that I just ended up overcompensating by a lot.
I don't think you're alone in that because I've heard that before from people who are in the Marine Corps. Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think you're alone in that at all. I think it's like trying to conform to these societal norms of masculinity and, the Marine Corps, has this image of being, the most hyper masculine of the hyper masculine. Right. And
Yeah.
so,
I role played a
yeah.
man for 13 years. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, there you go. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think that's the case for so many, right? And yeah, and I know so many people across the spectrum who in the role playing space, one of my really good friends and colleagues that I worked with for years at one of the colleges I work at, and he's now run off and is currently applying to medical schools. He just finished all of his stuff and he's applying to medical schools. But he would tell these stories about how he was in Afghanistan as a combat medic, and he used to sit around and they had he said they had a piece of plywood that they would have all of their maps for their game and stuff on, and they would be playing Pathfinder in their downtime, and so many people I know who are, like you said, it's huge in the military. And I think, again, it's another environment where, you have in the military a lot of moments where you have people who maybe are in areas where there's not a lot going on at that particular moment. You have these punctuated moments of maybe excitement, but like a lot of downtime that they have, and they're, you're sitting and waiting for something. I've even, had again, in through that job that I worked in fire protection, we had contracts where government contracts where we would have people that would go overseas to work on some of the bases and do like 6 month or year long contracts. And one of the guys came back. I remember coming back and he was like, yeah, he says, well, I got over there. And anyone who knows the military and military contract, he's like, yeah, I got over there. And they were like, well, you're supposed to be upgrading he was in Kuwait, and they were like, you're supposed to be upgrading the systems on the base, but we don't have the parts yet. So you're just going to have to hang out. So he hung out for 6 months waiting for the parts. And then the parts finally arrived. And he said, oh, cool. Finally, I can get to work. And they're like, no, we've got to inventory all this before you can start. So he spent another month while they inventoried everything. And what did he do the whole time? Played role playing games. He sat around and hung out and played role playing games because
Yeah.
what else were they going to do?
My first time playing fifth edition was actually in the middle of 29 Palms, like in the middle of a desert, and we were just waiting for shit to happen. And yeah, my first character miniatures was like cigarette butts and rocks, and like we
Yeah.
had we had a DMG, a PHB, and that was it. And someone just running the game, and we were like drawing in the sand or whatever for like the maps, and yeah, it was great.
Did you train at Pendleton?
Yeah, I spent 7 years at Pendleton, and then I was in
Mm-hmm.
recruiting in Washington State for a while, and then I went to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, and those were like
Okay.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
major bases that I went to. And I went to a lot of other bases for training and stuff, but like
Right.
that's where I lived. Yeah, I was at Pendleton for 7 years. Yeah.
Yeah. I grew up in Southern California. So,
Okay,
uh,
yeah. What
yeah.
part?
I was in the greater Los Angeles area, so we moved around a fair amount. So I grew up born originally in South LA, kind of,
Yeah.
and then lived in Pico Rivera, Montebello, Alhambra,
Yeah.
West Covina, La Puente, like all over
Yeah.
Southern California. As a matter of fact, I was kind of heartbroken by the news of the shooting that happened in Monterey Park last night. There was a mass shooting there
Yeah.
that just came out because I grew up like 10 blocks from where the shooting happened. And like literally right up the street from there was a little movie theater that all through the weekend, all day, Saturday and Sunday, you could pay like 50 cents and sit there all day, and they would show martial arts action movies. And
Oh,
so I spent many a weekend just go there and pay my 50 cents, and I'd sit there with a 50-cent tub of popcorn and sit
yeah.
there all day and watch martial arts cinemas. Then I'd walk down the street and there were just like a host of like Vietnamese and Chinese, predominantly Vietnamese and Chinese restaurants in that area. And I would just go down there and get something to eat, and that was
Mhm.
like I spent many Saturdays doing that or Sundays doing that back then. And I was like so tragic. I was like, man, I remember like that neighborhood.
Everything going on. I think it was 150 proposed laws in the new year of anti-trans laws, and with
Yeah.
the ban of African American studies in Florida. What do you think about the importance of teaching African American studies?
I think both African American studies and all studies across and gender studies, all of it is absolutely critical right now. We're having these debates over and people like hear words like buzzwords like critical race theory. They don't most people don't even understand what critical race theory is, what it's about. There's all of this kind of like buzzy language that's like, oh, it's just there to make white people feel guilty about themselves and all of this other nonsense. There's just this wave of kind of like anti-intellectualism in America, and it's our fault as a nation. We've kind of done this to ourselves, or I should say, at least those in power have done this to us. To be more to the point, but we've kind of let it happen in this country. We've kind of like quietly allowed ourselves to believe that there's nothing that we can do about it. And we need to be speaking up. We need to be challenging these things. I talk about it extensively in some of the courses I teach. There's a wonderful document. Well, it's not a wonder, it's an awful document actually. But so there's a group called the Trilateral Commission, and they don't hide themselves at all, but most people don't know they exist. They wrote after in the 1970s when they were formed. They put together a report. I mean, you can find it online. They don't hide it. It's called The Crisis of Democracy. And I really urge anyone who hasn't read it to read it. What they did was they wanted to examine what had happened in Western democracies in the 1960s to cause like the unrest of the 60s globally, and they wanted to examine what it was. And in a nutshell, the TLDR of the document, people in Western liberal democracies were too educated, and that we wanted an educated populace, but not an over-educated populace, and that what we needed to do was dumb down the populace. And so very shortly thereafter, this report came out. The Trilateral Commission, made up of Rockefeller was one of the key in architects. Several other very wealthy people contributed and got a peanut farmer from Georgia elected, and he was instrumental in creating what we know today as the U.S. Department of Education as it stands in its current form. And then very shortly thereafter, in the 80s, we started to get standardized testing and a lot of processes and things like that in schooling in America. And here we are today now in this kind of mode of education. And what we're seeing is this very frightening populace that has been educated, but not too educated. And we're seeing this anti intellectual push back on things like gender studies, like African American studies, like critical race theory, and things like that, where we should be asking these questions. And like I was talking about before, re examining our past through lenses, because we've been told a lot of things and some of those things are being challenged. So, for instance, one of the things that I kind of dive into a lot, these discussions that have come up about things like the Lord of the Rings and things like that, and about whether or not POC existed in medieval Europe. They did, not in great numbers, but they did. As a matter of fact, my second of those three theses that I was talking about was written about two 13th century Arthurian tales about Black African Arthurian knights. Everybody knows Lancelot, everybody knows Gawain and things like that. Very few people know Morian and Ferefus, the two knights in question. These are used and they're perpetuated, these ideas of like an all white, exclusively white medieval Europe come from these conceptions of race that were shaped by white male professors and their biases. And so recently, there's been a range of professors led by Dr. Geraldine Hing out of the University of Texas, Austin, and several others who have been questioning, like saying, hey, can we go back and re-examine our history and look at them with a different set of eyes? And they are asking questions about, well, we're told that modern racism, as we know it today, began here. And a lot of people place that in the kind of post-Enlightenment period as science started to create these categorizations of modern race. This group of scholars is saying, maybe not. Maybe it's older than that. Let's go back and re-examine these things. All of that, I think, is to say that we have these conceptions and these misconceptions. Part of that has flowed into the way people are educated or undereducated today, and it's contributing to a anti-intellectual backlash and a pushback against studies of like African American studies, gender studies, and things like that. It's also part of this very frightening movement, like you mentioned, laws that are coming out, all of these anti-trans and, bathroom bills and don't say gay and just awful, awful things that just turns my stomach and infuriates me. And the whole thing, like you mentioned, with DeSantis and African American studies in Florida, it's a scary, scary time to see these things happening.
Yeah, it's something that I talk to my partner about pretty frequently because she grew up in Georgia, and she meets people all the time who just don't know a lot of the major events of the civil rights movement and didn't know
Yes.
a lot of the atrocities that are not taught in school
Yeah.
because it's going to make white people feel guilty.
Right. It
Yeah,
makes it
and
so easy to deny stuff,
yeah, and a lot of that, unfortunately, not unfortunately, I love living in Washington State, but we live in such a, we live in such a white area of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're
Yeah.
75 or 70% white in Washington.
Yeah.
And and it's more than that in some areas. I grew up in a place called Tacoma it's actually
Yeah.
I looked this up. Tacoma is the blackest place in Washington State.
Yeah.
My childhood was different than most Washingtonians' childhood because I like
Mm-hmm.
knew and experienced a lot more people of color and had that childhood with them. And then for me to be now with somebody, to be partnered with somebody who is black, and they will go their entire day without seeing another person of color in their job or whatever it might be. And
Yeah.
some of the way that people treat her is just appalling, and like the things that they say
Yeah.
to her, and like just as an example of like some of the really weird shit that old white guys tell her, like she's been called like chocolate goddess and stuff, just like as fucking
Oh gosh.
stranger.
Yes.
Just like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like, what the fuck? How do you leave
Yeah.
with that?
Right. My wife, she has family, cousins and an uncle and stuff that all are up in Renton, Washington.
Same
And so,
area.
yeah, I'm familiar with the region and the area. And yeah, it is. It's very much, it's a very interesting, I really point to that. And then I have a really good friend, one of the guys that I played with for years in my high school years, and he's white, but great friend and lifelong friend, and that I met through role playing, and he's in Portland, Oregon, and both of those Portland, Oregon, and Washington, they have this really weird there's this weird kind of white liberal kind of thing there,
Oh, it's
but
racist.
through that, it's so weirdly racist, but they don't think they're racist.
Yep.
They think they're like really kind of like these paragons of white liberalism and like saving and helping the poor
White savior
people of
complex.
color. Yeah,
White
oh,
savior complex.
absolutely,
Yeah.
100%. And it is kind of an interest for those who have the opportunity to experience. It's just a strange thing to experience if you've ever been to those parts of the country, because it's like,
Yeah.
wow, you people really think you're like, yeah,
You
it's pretty huge.
Yeah, it's like I don't know. Like I was very surprised, but then not surprised once I like started, because I used to live near Portland in Vancouver, Washington, across the river, so I went to Portland all the time.
Hmm.
And my brother lived in Portland, so I was in Portland quite a bit. And my experience in Portland was once I learned that a majority or like a huge subsection of the KKK moved to Portland in order
Yeah.
to like
Yeah.
reestablish themselves.
Yeah.
I saw so much more. Once I just learned that fact, I was just like, this makes a lot of sense. Why
Yeah.
this is the way that it is. Because if you go even a little bit outside Portland, if you go even a little bit outside Seattle, you'll run into these hyper conservative areas of both Washington and Oregon that are just
Yeah.
filled with so much racism that it's just
Oh,
mind-boggling because they will take their view of Seattle and the urban centers in Portland, and they will view that place as being this hyper liberal environment that they despise, and
yes.
along with it, the people of color within that
Oh
area.
yeah, I absolutely get it. So where I live here in Colorado Springs, El Paso County, where Colorado Springs is located, was identified multiple times in the late '90s and early 2000s as the reddest county in the nation. So even now, Colorado Springs itself, the city itself, when we vote, it tends to go. If you look at the map, Colorado Springs comes out kind of like this very light shade of pink because the city votes overwhelmingly blue. The areas around the city and the rest of the county are the reddest red you can get. And so we have this very super ultra conservative like bastion that we're kind of surrounded by here. And as a matter of fact, I was just reading this, stomach churning horrid story about a black rancher who's right here in El Paso County, who owns 1,000-acre ranch here. And he's got this concerted effort of white people trying to run him off his land. He's been run off the road. He's been had all of these horrid things, and it's just a few miles away from me. And it's just chilling kind of this what we're seeing around this country and this kind of like divide of like when you look at our map of elections, you have these very kind of blue urban centers dotted around the country, and we're just surrounded by a sea of red. And there's this kind of like frightening divide, this urban rural divide. And I've spent time in my former job. Of course, we traveled all over the southern half of Colorado, out of the Colorado Springs office. And, I would go to some of these things. And I remember going to one of the smaller towns here. I was with one of my coworkers, and he was at the time, he was in his 60s, older white gentleman that I worked with. Great guy. I remember us walking into a restaurant down there where we were working. We finished working. We went to go get something to eat, walk into this restaurant. And it was like something out of an old Western. Everyone stopped. You could hear fork clinking on plates as everyone turned and looked at us, standing there in the entryway of this little mom and pop style restaurant. This gentleman that I was working with, he like looks and he looked down and he looked to me and he's like, "What is happening?" He's like, "Is my fly open? What is going on?" And I'm all, "Dave, I'm black." And he's like, "Oh." So yeah, I get that kind of like weird, and it's so strange. Like right now, the way that division is kind of coming to the forefront in our country through like some of these chilling bits of legislation that disgusting things.
And me looking back on especially the military, and I talked about this with Kimchi because he also has
Mm-hmm.
family that was in the military, and
Yeah,
I never examined it until, of course, like towards the end of my career in the military and me getting out now, looking back in hindsight, like the military is such a white supremacist organization, essentially, in the way that it's like built
yeah,
and how it
yeah,
discriminates on people of color, and like from everything from like the hairstyles that you're allowed to the way that you're allowed to act and everything like that, because
yes,
the doctrine and all of the military code of the uniform code of military justice is written by college educated white people who were brought up in the system, obviously, to support white supremacy. So
yeah,
me examining it now, and I'm like looking at all this stuff as I'm learning about like what is the basis of like white supremacy, and like why do we have the police problem that we have, and why do we have these issues with people supporting these laws that don't make any sense in order to discriminate, but
yeah,
it supports white supremacy. And it's like, oh, okay, good to know that. I was like, sometimes it's very difficult when you're
yeah,
within it, of course, to see these things. But of course, looking back to, and I'm not innocent in the behavior either. And
sure,
one of the
sure,
things that I have really tried to do better now is the pronunciation of people's names properly and
Sure, sure.
respecting people's names. Because I remember even in the military, like I had this
Hmm.
attitude which was reinforced by the structure, but I made the choice to not respect people's names
Yeah,
in that if someone had like a Spanish way of saying their name, sometimes I wouldn't do it, or I would
yeah,
like, or they had a difficult name to say or something like that. Sometimes I just wouldn't do it, and
yeah.
that is like rooted in white supremacy. So,
Oh,
like,
absolutely. Yeah, I
yeah,
get it. I think, and that's one of the things, I talk a lot about is that we have this, I was growing up, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and man, we were brutal. We were brutal. I said things back then about people in the gay community and things like that that I would punch myself in the face for today. Just awful, horrid things. The hope is that we can turn things around and get enough people to learn and grow and things like that. I like to say, progress, not perfection. It's all about growth and learning and things like that. I say so many times that I'm kind of glad that I didn't grow up. When I grew up, there were not people. I didn't have to have the concern that every single person around me had the ability to record for all eternity my stupidity.
yeah,
Because I did some things that were horrid that I'm glad were not recorded because I'm happy to leave those parts of me and those things in my past. And say, I'm glad I've grown past them, but I'm glad that I don't have to worry about them being dredged back up. A lot of young people do today, because I think we all have those moments, hopefully, at least those of us who are willing to change and grow. We all have those things in our past that we are not proud of. I think it's better if we can learn from them, grow from them, and then move on from them and not have to revisit them. We've all been there. We've all had those things, like you said, and yeah, the military. Like I said, growing up with, my dad, like I said, as a a Marine, that's just that kind of mindset that kind of gets hammered into you. If you can't pronounce somebody's name, then you give them some kind of a joke, jokey, quote unquote, kind of like private alphabet or whatever you're going to call them, or you're going to mispronounce their name or whatever. And you're right, that is so rooted in white supremacy. And so much of our past is that people don't realize. And those are the things that people are afraid to explore because they're like, oh, like you said, it's going to make people feel bad about themselves. And that's not the point. The point is to understand these things in our past and understand that, yes, our nation is rooted in white supremacist and racist ideals. I have a couple of colleagues who have a YouTube channel, Revolution in Ideology. Jared and Nick, they're great colleagues, former professors, now colleagues of mine. They do some wonderful explorations where they go back and they look at like the evolution of the first law enforcement and the first laws and things like that in our past. And one of them is a sociologist, one of them is a historian. So they look at it from both perspectives and they look at these things and they say, hey, why were the first law? What were the first laws? And the first laws in Jamestown, you go all the way back to early things, and the first law enforcement was to track down fugitive slaves. And so, and they share these primary source documents. That's what this was all about. And things that people we just don't learn and we don't teach because it's uncomfortable. But growth is uncomfortable. We need to face that and we need to deal with that. And it's not about, it's not, the goal here isn't to make people feel bad. The goal here isn't to make people feel awful. The goal is to understand what these things are, why they exist, and how we can work past them. But everybody is just terrified of, like, so many people on that side, they just don't want to hear it and they want to put on their rose-colored glasses, only talk about the good things and ignore the bad. And I think right now, with some of the legislations that come in, we're witnessing the danger of the true, real danger of that and the harm that it is doing. And it sickens me because when I hear the language that is being used against the LGBTQ community, the language, I tell people that the bigot playbook is really more of a leaflet because they're using the exact same language that was used to challenge interracial marriage. They're using the exact same language that was used to support segregation. They're using the exact same playbook in the exact same language because that's all they've got. It's very limited. And you mentioned it before when you mentioned Dracula, right? The language is very standardized. They're coming for our women. You know, they're going to be assaulting women in restrooms and things like that. They want to challenge everything and turn everything, whether you're talking about people who are queer or whether you're talking about black men. They want to turn it into sexual predation, sexual deviancy, to stoke fear and hatred. Not very creative, but sadly, with a segment of the population, highly effective.
You know, it's important for me to say that I have been racist and I have been transphobic and I've been homophobic, and it's very easily, you know, it's
Yeah.
very easy to internalize these things and, you know, and to
Yes.
represent these structures that we're raised in. But that doesn't have to be everybody's future. That doesn't have to be who you are anymore.
Yes. Yeah. No, man, I'm right there with you. I've been there. I've said homophobic things, sexist things, all across the board, right there. And you're right. It is so easy. You know, I tell people one of the things I talk about, you know, when you know, on the role playing side of things, is that for probably the first 13, 14 years that I role played, I never played a character who looked like me. Pretty much all of my characters were either white, or they were awful characterizations of either indigenous peoples or Asian or something along that line, because that's what I saw portrayed, culturally portrayed. You know, heroes were white. Heroes were that looked like John Wayne or sometimes Bruce
Yeah.
Lee, but they weren't people that looked like me. And I
Yeah.
totally internalized that for like the longest time playing role playing games.
Yeah, it's so important that we have representation in our games and our media for that reason, because I
Mm-hmm.
remember seeing in like when I was going through my initial journey and transformation being trans, and I remember seeing Lou Anders' source book, Thrones and Bones, and like there was a trans character in it. And
Yeah,
that meant so much to me at that time. I can only imagine like growing up, as you did and not seeing any black characters in tabletop
yeah,
games, except
yeah.
as racist characters that were the enemy.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the things I wrote about in my article and in my thesis was, you know, I went back and I examined Dragon Magazine and that first 10 years of Dragon Magazine. And I said, you know, okay, how many times am I going to see black faces? When I saw black faces, they were either, you know, and I pulled some images that I shared. Like one of them was this terrible, caricature of, you know, it's a black man and he's holding a spear and he's in leopard skin. It's this very stereotypical kind of African quote unquote hunter image. And then it was images where they were either the sidekick or subservient or they were the villain. And there were very exceedingly few exceptions to that in that first 10 years. I could count them on one hand in the first 10 years of Dragon magazine. And the few exceptions that did exist were Dragon magazine had a section for TSR's Marvel role playing game. And they would put stats for heroes from Marvel Comics in there. And so you had, you know, Black Panther and Falcon and characters like that that appeared in that section. But if you looked at the sections that dealt with all of the other role playing games that were kind of behind the curve of where comics had started to introduce, you know, black characters in the 1960s and stuff and into the 70s. If you looked at things that were tied to D&D or Space Master or those other games that existed at the time, black characters were nearly absent. And when they were present, they were almost always the sidekick or subservient, like I said, you know, to one degree or another. And that was, you know, the representation that like so many grew up. And then to finally have that realization, I think for me in the 90s, oh man, black people can be heroes, right? And to see things, those representational moments. And I tell this story all the time. I didn't realize it at the time. But when I look back on it now, I can analyze it. When I was 12 years old, I remember this movie came out. It's a cheesy ass movie. It's one of the few movies that I think has a 0 rating on Rotten Tomatoes.
Wow.
It's called Megaforce. It's a really cheesy, super just cheeseball 80s movie, 1982. As a kid, me and my friends loved it because it has these kind of like it's supposed to be about this multinational covert force that's fighting for good around the world and stuff like that. They had these motorcycles that had like rockets and machine guns on them, and we thought that was the coolest thing we'd ever seen as 12-year-old kids. But one of the things that came out of that movie that I never ever forget, and I always look back on this kind of with fondness, is that there's a character in there who is black. When you first encounter the character, he is sitting there, and this kind of he meets this very stuffy white British general, and he's listening on his Walkman to music, and the general says Gladys Knight and the Pips, and he says no, Vivaldi. And the white general is like, oh, spring, and he's like, no, winter. And then shortly thereafter, he makes a quote. The black character makes a quote from Shakespeare. And so, as a 12-year-old kid, obviously, when we would play, and most of my friends at that time were white. When we would go out and we would play, we would, of course, like kids do, you would mimic the movie you had just seen, right? You would play the characters in the movie. No shock who got to be the black character every single time, right? Who got to be Lando Calrissian if we were playing Star Wars? It was this guy, right?
Yeah.
In fact, it was not I got to be Lando Calrissian. I was Lando Calrissian. There wasn't any question, right? Like,
right.
When I look back on it, it didn't dawn on me at the time. And there's another scene with this black character where one of the characters is frustrated trying to solve a Rubik's Cube. And the black character kind of like waves his hand and says, toss it to me, right? And they toss it to him and he solves it in seconds, right? And that was the first time when I was a kid playing these games that I got to be the smart character. That was the first time that I got to be the one who was quoting Shakespeare.
Wow.
I got to be the bright one. And that, like, again, I didn't like, it was amazing. But now looking back on it, I'm like, representation, right? Like,
yeah,
that had an impact. Like, I was like, I get to be the smart one this time,
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Thank you so much for coming on, Stefan.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Anytime you want to talk, and anybody who wants to track me down on Twitter and you want to talk about role-playing games and race and marginalized communities and history of marginalized communities, I'm always open for it.
Yeah, and I made it to the end of the podcast before crying. So it's a new record for me.
Well, there you go. Well, yeah, representation matters, right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Stefan. I'm going to hit the stop
Thank
button
you
now.
thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to the Dollars and Dragons podcast. If you'd like to support me, and more importantly, my editor who does all of the heavy lifting here, then you can subscribe to patreon.com/isfriday. And that is going to go straight to my editor. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.